The morning shift began like any other on the Celestial Harmony station, and Lorena walked through the observation corridor with her silver hair flowing behind her like starlight, and her violet eyes scanning the peaceful darkness of space that stretched endlessly in all directions, and beside her padded Ember and Frost, her two bonded dragons who had been with her since they hatched from their eggs 70 years ago, when she first took the position of diplomatic liaison. Ember was the smaller of the two, with scales that gleamed like polished rubies in the station's artificial light, and his temperament matched his fiery appearance because he was quick to anger and protective of Lorena, to the point of aggression against anyone who approached too quickly, and his wings, though folded against his body, were strong enough to carry him through the station's lower gravity sections where he loved to hunt the maintenance drones that scurried along the walls. Frost was larger and calmer, with scales of pale blue that seemed to glow with an inner cold light, and ice crystals formed in the air around him when he was content, and he preferred to lounge in the cooler storage sections of the station, where visiting merchants kept their perishable goods, and the workers had learned to leave him alone, because a sleeping ice dragon was not something any sane person disturbed without very good reason. The station itself was a marvel of engineering, built by the combined efforts of 17 species over 200 years, and it served as a neutral trading hub where beings from across the sector could meet and exchange goods and ideas without fear of conflict. And the rules were strict because weapons were forbidden in public areas, and all disputes had to be resolved through mediation, and violence of any kind resulted in permanent banishment from the station and all associated trade routes. Lorena loved her work because every day brought new faces and new cultures, and new opportunities to build bridges between species who might otherwise never understand each other. And she took pride in the fact that in her 70 years of service, she had helped negotiate hundreds of successful trade agreements and resolved countless cultural misunderstandings before they could escalate into serious problems. Today she was scheduled to meet with a delegation from the Kryn battle clans who wanted to discuss opening new mining operations in the asteroid fields near the station, and the Kryn were a warrior culture who valued strength and directness above all else. And Lorena had learned over the years that the best way to deal with them was to be equally direct and never show weakness or uncertainty, because they respected honesty even when they disagreed with the message. She was reviewing the proposal documents on her personal data pad when the station's alert system activated with a soft chime that echoed through the corridors, and Lorena looked up with mild curiosity because alerts were rare on such a well-managed station, and most issues were resolved long before they required station-wide notifications. The message appeared on every display screen simultaneously, and Lorena felt her breath catch in her throat as she read the words that would change everything, because the sensors had detected multiple vessels emerging from jump space at the edge of the system, and the ships were broadcasting Earth identification codes and requesting approach clearance to the station. Ember hissed softly, sensing Lorena's sudden spike of anxiety through their bond, and Frost raised his head from where he had been dozing against the cool wall, and both dragons moved closer to their bonded companion. With protective instincts suddenly alert, Lorena had never seen humans before, because Earth was classified as a restricted world, and its inhabitants were listed in the Galactic database with warning labels that made even the most fearless traders think twice before making contact, and the reasons were simple and terrifying. Because humans came from a Deathworld. A Deathworld was a planet so hostile to life that merely surviving there required adaptations that made the inhabitants incredibly dangerous by galactic standards, and Earth was considered one of the worst examples because its gravity was crushing by most species standards, and its atmosphere was thick with reactive oxygen that corroded metal and caused fires, and its surface was covered with deadly predators and poisonous plants and violent weather that could kill in countless ways. Humans who grew up in such an environment developed bone density twice that of normal species and muscle strength that let them move in heavy gravity with ease, and reflexes honed by constant danger, and an endurance that seemed almost supernatural to beings from gentler worlds. And their psychology was equally adapted because humans formed pack bonds that made them fiercely loyal and protective, and they had an aggressive streak that made them terrifying in combat. The galactic community had made contact with Earth 50 years ago, and the initial meetings had been cautious because everyone knew that Deathworlders could be unpredictable and dangerous, and the humans had been surprisingly diplomatic at first and eager to trade and learn about the wider galaxy. But then the incidents started happening. Human merchants got into fights with pirates and won with brutal efficiency, and human security personnel subdued station riots that should have required military intervention, and human athletes broke records in sporting events so thoroughly that most competitions now had separate categories for Deathworlder. Participants in the gladiatorial combat leagues had banned humans entirely after 3 human fighters killed their opponents, despite the matches being supposedly non-lethal. Stories spread through the trading routes about human durability and human aggression and human pack bonding that made them willing to die for complete strangers. And most species decided that avoiding humans was the wisest course of action. And trade with Earth remained limited to a few brave or desperate merchants who were willing to risk dealing with Deathworlders. Now 20 human warships were approaching Celestial Harmony Station, and Lorena felt genuine fear for the first time in decades, because she had no idea what humans wanted or why they had come, in such numbers and military vessels at that, which suggested they were not here for peaceful trading. She made her way quickly to the command center, where Lord Vestian, the station commander, was already frantically coordinating with his staff, and the main display showed the approaching human fleet. And Lorena stopped in her tracks when she saw the ships, because they were nothing like the elegant vessels used by civilized species. Human ships were brutal angular things made of thick armor, plating with none of the smooth curves that marked proper engineering. And they bristled with weapon ports and sensor arrays, and their engines burned with a harsh blue-white light that seemed aggressive even from a distance. And they moved through space with a purpose and precision that suggested military training and combat readiness. Vestian turned to Lorena with his face pale beneath his ceremonial robes and his hand shaking slightly as he gestured to the display, and he asked her opinion as diplomatic liaison. But his voice cracked with barely controlled panic, and Lorena understood because the station had no real defenses beyond basic shields, designed to deflect micrometeorites, and if the humans decided to attack, there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. She stepped forward and studied the formation of human ships and noticed that they were maintaining proper approach vectors and had not powered up their weapons systems, and their communication requests were polite, if direct. And she took a deep breath and told Vestian that they should respond normally and grant approach clearance, because refusing would likely provoke exactly the confrontation they wanted to avoid. Vestian nodded reluctantly and opened a communication channel, and his voice was surprisingly steady as he welcomed the human fleet to Celestial Harmony Station and requested their purpose for visiting, and the response came within seconds. A woman's voice filled the command center with words spoken in perfect galactic standard, though the accent was strange and carried an edge of controlled anger that made everyone in the room tense, and she identified herself as Captain Amy Brooks of the Earth vessel Defiant Storm, and stated that the human fleet was pursuing Zareth slavers who had raided human colonies and taken captive children, and their trail led directly to this station, where intelligence suggested 3 Zareth vessels were currently docked. Lorena felt her stomach drop, because the Zareth were one of the few species even more feared than humans, and they operated as pirates and slavers throughout the outer sectors, and they had no respect for galactic law or neutral zones, and their presence on the station was technically legal, because Celestial Harmony maintained strict neutrality and could not refuse docking to any species without proof of criminal intent. Vestian tried to explain about treaties and neutral ground and proper legal procedures, and how the station could not simply hand over docked vessels without formal charges filed through the proper channels, and his voice took on the bureaucratic tone that diplomats used when they wanted to hide behind regulations instead of making difficult decisions. Captain Brooks listened in silence until Vestian finished speaking, and then her response was cold and precise and left no room for negotiation, because she stated that the Zareth had forfeited any protection under galactic law when they kidnapped human children, and that Earth did not recognize any treaty or neutral zone that sheltered those who harmed the innocent, and the human fleet would breach the station in 10 minutes if the Zareth were not immediately surrendered. The command center erupted in chaos as Vestian's staff began shouting suggestions and arguing about protocols, and several members suggested evacuating the station immediately, while others insisted they should contact the Galactic Council for guidance, and Vestian himself seemed frozen, unable to make a decision as the countdown continued. Lyrina moved to the communications console and opened a direct channel to the Zareth docking bay and demanded to speak with the ship captains, and the response came quickly, because the Zareth had been monitoring all communications, and they knew exactly what was happening outside the station. The Zareth captain appeared on the screen with his reptilian features twisted in what might have been amusement, and his voice was a hissing rasp as he stated that he and his crew had done nothing wrong and were simply transporting cargo between systems, and if the station had any proof of criminal activity, they should present it through proper channels. Lyrina felt Ember growl beside her, and even Frost, who was normally calm, released a small puff of cold air that frosted the console because dragons could sense lies and evil intentions, and both of her companions recognized that the Zareth was guilty of exactly what the humans claimed. She asked directly about the human children, and whether the Zareth vessels were carrying any captives, and the captain's amusement grew as he denied having any humans aboard his ships, and challenged the station to conduct a search if they doubted his word, knowing full well that such a search would take hours to arrange and execute properly. The timer showed 7 minutes remaining before the human deadline expired, and Lyrina made a decision that would either save lives or end her career, because she turned to Vestian and stated clearly that the station should grant the human fleet permission to board and search the Zareth vessels, because protecting slavers was not neutrality. It was complicity. Vestian stared at her in shock and stammered that they could not simply allow armed Deathworlders to board ships in their station, and that it violated every protocol and would set a dangerous precedent, and other species would fear to trade here if neutrality meant nothing. Lyrina met his eyes and spoke with the authority of someone who had served longer than anyone else currently on the station, and she reminded him that neutrality was meant to protect peaceful trade, not shield criminals, and that the Zareth had a known history of slaving operations, and refusing to help recover kidnapped children would damage the station's reputation far more than cooperating with Earth. Before Vestian could respond, the situation changed dramatically because the Zareth made their own decision, and suddenly their 3 ships began emergency departure procedures and tore away from the docking clamps without waiting for clearance, and alarms screamed throughout the station as the violent separation damaged multiple docking ports and atmosphere began venting from the breached seals. Lyrina watched the main display in horror as the Zareth ships accelerated toward the system's edge, trying to reach jump distance before the human fleet could intercept them, and emergency crews scrambled to seal the breaches while thousands of civilians throughout the station began evacuating to emergency shelters following the automated safety protocols. The human response was immediate and overwhelming, because their ships moved with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for vessels of their size, and within seconds they had cut off every escape route and positioned themselves between the fleeing Zareth and open space. Lyrina saw small craft launch from the human carriers, and these fighters were tiny compared to the main warships, but they moved with incredible agility and darted between the larger vessels like insects swarming around prey, and their weapons fire was precise and targeted, striking the Zareth ship's engines and weapon systems without causing catastrophic damage. She realized that the humans were not trying to destroy the Zareth. They were disabling them and keeping them intact, which meant the humans genuinely wanted prisoners who could be questioned and tried, rather than simply executing the slavers, which would have been faster and easier. Captain Brooks' voice came through the open channel again, and this time she was speaking directly to the Zareth, and her words were cold with barely controlled fury, as she gave them one final chance to surrender and release any captives unharmed, or face the full military response of an Earth fleet that had crossed 8 systems to find them. The Zareth captain's response was predictable because slavers and pirates rarely surrendered peacefully, and instead of complying, he ordered his ships to open fire on the nearest human vessel, and Lyrina gasped because she knew that attacking Deathworlders was essentially suicide. The Zareth weapon struck the human destroyer with multiple direct hits, and the energy readings showed impacts that should have crippled or destroyed the vessel, and Lyrina waited for the explosion that would mark the destruction of the human ship, but it never came. Instead, the human destroyer barely slowed, and its shields flared brilliant colors as they absorbed the energy, and its hull took the kinetic impacts without breaching, and the ship simply shrugged off an attack that would have obliterated any other species vessel, and then it returned fire with such overwhelming force that the Zareth flagship simply ceased to exist in a flash of white light and expanding debris. The command center fell absolutely silent as everyone stared at the display and processed what they had just witnessed, because the casual ease with which the human ship had survived and retaliated demonstrated a level of military technology and durability that was generations beyond what the galaxy considered possible. Lorena understood in that moment that every story about Deathworlder durability and resilience was not just true, but actually understated, because human ships were built to the same brutal standards as the humans themselves, and they could absorb punishment that would destroy lesser vessels and keep fighting. The remaining 2 Zareth ships tried to scatter, but the human fleet had already surrounded them, and more fighters swarmed in to disable their engines, and within minutes both vessels were dead in space, with human boarding parties attaching to their hulls and cutting through the airlocks. Vestian finally found his voice and asked weakly what they should do now, and Lorena told him they should offer medical facilities and cooperation, because the humans had just demonstrated that they could take whatever they wanted by force, and the fact that they were still following proper procedures and asking for permission suggested they valued civilized behavior despite their overwhelming military advantage. She opened a channel to Captain Brooks and identified herself as the station's diplomatic liaison, and offered the station's full cooperation in recovering the kidnapped children and treating any injured parties, and asked if there was anything Celestial Harmony could do to assist. Captain Brooks' response was immediate and surprisingly warm, considering the violence that had just occurred, and she thanked Lorena for the offer of cooperation and stated that human boarding teams had secured the Zareth vessels and confirmed the presence of captives, including 17 human children ranging in age from 5 to 14 years old, and the children were alive but traumatized and in need of immediate medical attention. Lorena felt relief wash over her, because despite the destruction and chaos, at least the children had been found alive, and she quickly coordinated with the station's medical staff to prepare treatment facilities and arranged for trauma counselors who had experience with kidnapping victims, and she made sure that private rooms were set aside, because she suspected the children would need quiet spaces away from the crowds and noise. The human fleet requested permission to dock their medical transport at the main civilian terminal, and Vestian granted it immediately, because even he understood that refusing to help injured children would be both morally wrong and politically catastrophic. And within 20 minutes, the human ship had docked, and the first boarding ramp extended Lorena made her way to the docking area, with Ember and Frost following close behind. And she arrived just as the first human soldiers emerged, carrying small bundles wrapped in thermal blankets, and her breath caught, because the soldiers were massive compared to most species, and their armor made them look even larger and more intimidating. But they moved with surprising gentleness as they carried the rescued children. The first soldier she saw was a woman with dark skin visible through her open helmet, and she carried a human girl who looked about 8 years old, and the child was clinging to the soldier's neck, with her face buried against the armored shoulder, and the soldier was speaking softly to her in words Lorena could not hear, but the tone was unmistakably comforting. More soldiers followed, carrying children of several species, and Lorena realized that the Zareth had been taking captives from multiple colonies and not just targeting humans, and there were 2 small Viridian children, with their distinctive green skin, and 1 Pylaxian boy who was crying quietly, and 3 more human children who looked shell-shocked and exhausted. The station medical staff rushed forward to receive the children, but several of the rescued captives refused to let go of their human rescuers and clung tighter when strangers approached, and Lorena watched as the soldiers simply carried the children into the medical bay and stayed with them while the doctors performed their initial examinations. She approached the first soldier she had seen and introduced herself and asked if there was anything else the station could provide, and the woman removed her helmet, fully revealing a tired face with kind eyes, and introduced herself as Lieutenant Nicole Harper, and explained that most of the children were physically unharmed but deeply frightened, and they had bonded with their rescuers during the extraction. Ember and Frost moved closer to investigate the human, and Lorena expected Harper to show fear or at least caution because dragons were dangerous predators, but instead the lieutenant smiled with genuine delight and asked if she could touch them, because she had never seen real dragons before. Lorena gave permission and watched. in amazement as both of her dragons pressed their heads against Harper's hands and allowed her to stroke their scales, and Ember even chirped softly, which was his sign of approval and trust. And Frost released a small cloud of pleasant, cool air that indicated contentment. She explained to Harper that dragons could sense the nature of beings through some instinct that even elves did not fully understand, and they only showed trust to those with pure intentions and protective hearts, and Harper laughed and said that made sense because anyone who joined Earth's rescue forces did so, because they genuinely wanted to help people. More human personnel entered the station, and Lyrina observed them carefully, trying to understand these Deathworlders who had terrified the galaxy with their reputation for violence, but who now moved through the medical bay with professional courtesy and gentle efficiency. And she noticed that every human made eye contact and spoke respectfully to the station staff, and several thanked the medical personnel for their help in caring for the children. Captain Brooks arrived an hour later, and Lyrina recognized her immediately from the voice, though seeing her in person was different, because the captain was shorter than expected, but carried herself with the confidence of someone who had commanded in actual combat. And her uniform was neat despite the circumstances, and she moved with the easy grace of someone comfortable in her own body. Lyrina introduced herself formally and expressed gratitude for the humans recovering not just human children, but captives from other species as well. And Brooks smiled and said that Earth did not distinguish between species when it came to protecting children, and any being who harmed the young was humanity's enemy. Regardless of politics or treaties, they walked together through the station toward the observation deck, because Brooks wanted to see the damage the Zareth had caused during their escape attempt, and Lyrina explained that repair crews were already working on the breached docking ports and estimated full repairs within 36 hours, and Brooks immediately offered human engineering teams to assist, because her fleet carried personnel trained in rapid station repair. The offer surprised Lyrina because she had expected the humans to simply take their recovered children and leave, but Brooks explained that Earth held itself responsible for the collateral damage caused during the pursuit, even though the Zareth had initiated the destruction, and human policy was to repair any damage caused during their operations. They reached the observation deck and stood looking out at the human fleet, which had moved into a loose defensive formation around the station, and Brooks pointed out the different vessel types, and explained that Earth maintained 3 separate fleet groups, and this was actually one of the smaller rapid response forces designed specifically for rescue operations in hostile territory. Lyrina asked the question that had been bothering her since the fleet arrived, because she wanted to know why humans had come in such force for 17 children when most species would have filed formal complaints and waited for diplomatic solutions. And Brooks turned to face her directly, and her expression was absolutely serious, as she explained that Earth had learned hard lessons throughout its violent history. She said that humanity had seen what happened when evil was allowed to operate unopposed, and they had witnessed the cost of choosing convenience over justice and choosing politics over protecting the innocent. And Earth had made a collective decision centuries ago during their unification that they would never again look away when children were harmed, and they would never again let bureaucracy and procedure become excuses for inaction. Brooks continued that other species might consider humans excessive or dangerous, but humans considered themselves practical because they knew that slavers operated on the assumption that their victims were not worth the trouble of rescuing, and that authorities would choose the easy path of negotiation and paperwork over the difficult path of direct action. And by responding with overwhelming force, Earth sent a clear message that taking human children or any children within human protected space would result in immediate and devastating consequences. Lyrina felt tears forming in her eyes because she understood now that humans were not violent because they enjoyed destruction, but because they had decided that some things were worth fighting for, and protecting children was at the top of that list. And she asked Brooks what would happen to the Zareth prisoners. The captain explained that they would be taken to Earth for trial because human law applied to crimes against human citizens, and the evidence was overwhelming, and the sentences would be severe because Earth did not tolerate those who preyed on children, and the trial would be public so that other potential slavers could see exactly what awaited them if they chose to target human colonies. She also mentioned that Earth was working on new treaties with other species to create joint task forces specifically designed to combat slaving operations, because humans recognized that Zareth targeted vulnerable colonies regardless of species, and protecting children required cooperation across the galaxy, and several species had already expressed interest. Though many were still hesitant about working closely with Deathworlders, Ember suddenly chirped an alert, and both dragons moved to the viewport with their attention focused on something in the distance, and Lorena followed their gaze and felt ice fill her veins, because the station sensors were detecting a new contact emerging from the asteroid field, where it had apparently been hiding during the entire confrontation. The hidden vessel was a fourth Zareth ship larger than the three that had fled, and it had been waiting silently while its companions drew the human fleet's attention, and now it powered up its weapons and began moving toward the station with clear, hostile intent. And the sensor readings showed it was targeting the civilian sections where thousands of families were still sheltering from the earlier emergency. Lyrena's mind raced because the station's shields were designed for micrometeorite protection, not military-grade weapons, and a direct hit from a ship that size would punch through the defensive barriers like they were paper and kill hundreds, if not thousands, of innocent beings. And she grabbed the nearest communication panel and sent an emergency broadcast warning all sections to brace for impact. Captain Brooks was already moving before Lorena finished the warning, because the human had pulled out a compact communication device and was barking orders to her fleet in rapid-fire English, and her calm demeanor from moments ago had transformed into focused military precision, and she demanded immediate interception of the hostile vessel and deployment of point defense systems to protect the station. The human response was instantaneous because 6 ships broke from their formation and accelerated toward the station, with their engines burning at maximum thrust. And Lorena watched through the viewport as these vessels positioned themselves directly between the approaching Zareth ship and the civilian sections, creating a wall of human metal and technology. The Zareth captain must have realized his plan was failing, because instead of retreating, he fired everything his ship had at both the station and the intervening human vessels, and the energy readings spiked massively as particle beams and missile salvos launched in a desperate final attack. Lorena grabbed onto Ember as the first impact struck, because even at this distance, the station shook from the sheer force of the weapons fire, and Frost spread his wings protectively over both of them, creating a shield of ice magic that was completely inadequate for the situation. But the dragon's instinct to protect was too strong to suppress. Through the viewport, she saw the human ships take the full barrage head-on, and their shields flared with colors so bright it hurt to look directly at them. And the impacts that got through the shields struck armored hulls that buckled and deformed but did not breach, and the human vessels held their position, absorbing punishment that should have destroyed them. One human destroyer took a direct hit from 3 particle beams simultaneously, and the entire forward section glowed red-hot from the energy transfer. And Lorena was certain she was watching the ship's death, but it continued to hold position, even as atmosphere vented from multiple breaches, and its shields flickered but stabilized. The Zareth ship exhausted its ammunition and began to turn away, trying to flee now that its surprise attack had failed. But the human vessels that had taken such terrible punishment to protect the station now responded with their own weapons, and their fire was precise and overwhelming. Multiple railgun rounds struck the Zareth ship's engines, disabling its propulsion, and targeted energy beams cut through its weapon systems, eliminating any remaining threat. And the entire engagement took less than 90 seconds from first shot to complete neutralization, and the Zareth vessel was left drifting powerless in space. Captain Brooks lowered her communication device and turned to Lorena with an expression of grim satisfaction, and stated that the threat was contained and the station was secure. And then she paused and asked if Lorena was injured, because she had noticed the elf woman was shaking. Lorena realized she was indeed trembling, because she had just witnessed something that contradicted everything she thought she understood about warfare and self-preservation, because the human ships had deliberately placed themselves in harm's way to protect a station full of strangers, and had absorbed catastrophic damage rather than maneuver to safety. And she asked Brooks why the human vessels had not simply destroyed the Zareth ship before it could fire. The captain explained that the Zareth vessel had been holding human and alien captives in its cargo holds, and they had detected life signs, including children who were being held as insurance against exactly this kind of rescue attempt, and destroying the ship would have killed the very beings they came to save. so the human fleet had chosen to take the hits and disable the vessel carefully. Lyrina felt tears streaming down her face because the galaxy believed that Deathworlders were dangerous and violent and concerned only with their own survival. But she had just seen human beings choose to endure terrible harm to protect both their own species and complete strangers, and she understood now that humans were dangerous, not because they were cruel or savage, but because they cared so intensely about protecting others that they would sacrifice themselves without hesitation. She asked how badly the human ships were damaged and whether there were casualties, and Brooks checked her device and reported that 3 vessels had sustained major damage and would require dockyard repairs, and 17 crew members were injured with 2 in critical condition. But no fatalities, and the injured were already being treated by human medical teams. Lyrina immediately offered the station's medical facilities to help treat the wounded humans. But Brooks declined politely and explained that human physiology was different enough from other species that station doctors might do more harm than good, even with the best intentions, and human medics were trained specifically for Deathworlder biology and trauma patterns. The conversation was interrupted by an incoming message from the boarding teams who had breached the 4th Zareth vessel, and the news was both good and troubling, because they had found 23 more captive children from 6 different species, including 8 more humans. But the children were in worse condition than the first group, and several required immediate intensive care. Brooks immediately ordered her medical transport to prepare for critical cases and authorized the use of advanced human medical technology, even though Earth normally restricted such technology from other species, and she explained to Lyrina that saving lives took priority over technology security concerns. The rescued children began arriving within the hour, and Lyrina watched as human medics worked alongside station doctors in an impromptu collaboration, and she noticed that the humans were carefully teaching the station medical staff about trauma response techniques and sharing information about treating different species even in the midst of the crisis. One small Viridian girl, approximately 6 years old in human terms, was brought in unconscious and severely dehydrated, and the station doctors were struggling because Viridian physiology was delicate, and the standard treatments were not working fast enough, and the child's vital signs were dropping. A human medic named Katie Chen stepped forward and requested permission to try a human medical device that could stabilize cellular function and restore hydration at the molecular level, and she warned that the technology was experimental and had never been tested on Viridians, but doing nothing would certainly result in death. Lyrina, as diplomatic liaison, made the decision to authorize the treatment, because the alternative was watching the child die, and Chen activated a small device that looked deceptively simple and placed it against the child's chest, and within seconds the vital signs began to improve, and color returned to the green skin, and the Viridian girl's breathing stabilized. The station doctor stared in amazement and asked how the device worked, and Chen explained as simply as she could that it used targeted energy fields to manipulate cellular processes and encourage the body's own healing systems. And Earth had developed the technology from studying their own remarkable healing abilities and adapting those principles into medical tools. Over the next 3 hours, all 23 children were stabilized and moved into recovery rooms, and the human medical teams remained to monitor the more critical cases. And Lyrina noticed that several human soldiers who had participated in the rescue were sitting quietly in the waiting areas, refusing to leave until they knew all the children would survive. She approached one young soldier who looked barely old enough to serve in a military capacity and asked if he was injured because he was holding his arm carefully, and he smiled and admitted that he had broken it during the boarding action when he had shielded one of the children from falling debris, but he had not wanted to leave for treatment until he knew the kids were safe. Lyrina insisted he see a doctor immediately, and he reluctantly agreed, and as she watched him walk toward the medical bay, she realized that this was what made humans truly dangerous, because they formed bonds of protection and loyalty that made them willing to endure pain and sacrifice themselves for others. And that kind of dedication, combined with their physical durability and advanced technology, created beings who were unstoppable when defending something they cared about. Captain Brooks found her an hour later and reported that the last of the rescued children was out of danger and recovering well, and the human fleet would remain at the station for another day to complete repairs on the damaged vessels and ensure all the children were stable enough for transport to their home worlds. The following morning, Lorena made her way to the main docking bay, where the human fleet was preparing to depart, and she carried with her a formal commendation signed by Lord Vestian and the entire station council praising the humans for their heroic actions in rescuing the children and protecting the station. And she also brought personal gifts from many of the station's residents who wanted to express their gratitude. She found Captain Brooks supervising the loading of the Zareth prisoners, who were being transferred in secure containment modules, and the prisoners looked significantly less confident than when they had arrived, because they now understood that humans did not make idle threats and that their actions had consequences. Brooks accepted the commendation with grace and thanked Lorena for the station's cooperation during what could have been a much more difficult situation, and she mentioned that several other species had already contacted Earth about forming joint anti-slaving task forces, and it appeared that something positive might come from the tragedy. Lorena asked what would happen to the children after they recovered, and Brooks explained that Earth had specialists who worked with trauma survivors and helped them reunite with their families when possible, and the human embassy on each species' homeworld would coordinate the return process and ensure the children received whatever ongoing support they needed. She also mentioned that Earth was establishing a victim support fund to help the families of all the rescued children regardless of species, because humans recognized that recovering from such trauma took time and resources, and they wanted to ensure no family struggled alone, and several wealthy human corporations had already pledged substantial donations. Ember and Frost appeared from the corridor where they had been exploring, and both dragons immediately went to Captain Brooks and pressed their heads against her hands, seeking attention, and the captain laughed and obliged by scratching behind their ears in the way they particularly enjoyed. Lorena watched this interaction with wonder, because in all her years with the dragons, she had never seen them warm up to a stranger so quickly and completely. And she mentioned this to Brooks and explained again that dragons only showed such trust to beings with truly protective and pure hearts. Brooks smiled and confessed that she had always loved animals on Earth and had wanted to be a veterinarian before she joined the military, and she missed having pets, because military service meant too much travel and too little stability. But meeting dragons even briefly was a childhood dream come true. Several human crew members approached, carrying containers marked with medical symbols, and Brooks explained that these contained supplies for the station's medical bay, including some of the advanced technology they had used to save the Viridian child, and Earth was donating the equipment, along with training materials, because Brooks believed strongly that life-saving technology should be shared, not hoarded. Lorena was speechless, because such advanced medical technology was worth a fortune, and the humans were simply giving it away, and she asked why Earth would be so generous with technology that could have been sold for immense profit. Brooks' expression grew serious, and she explained that Earth had learned many painful lessons throughout its history, and one of the most important was that hoarding knowledge and technology while others suffered was morally wrong, and that humanity had a responsibility to help other species not exploit them. And besides, as she pointed out, no amount of profit was worth the life of a child who could have been saved. The captain checked her communication device and announced that the fleet needed to depart soon, because they had received reports of another slaving operation in a nearby sector, and the human response force was mobilizing to investigate, and she hoped that perhaps this time they would arrive before any children were taken. Lorena impulsively asked if she could accompany the human fleet, because she wanted to learn more about Earth and its people and perhaps help facilitate better relations between humans and the wider galactic community. And she could serve as a cultural liaison and help the humans understand the various species they encountered. Brooks looked surprised but pleased by the offer, and she admitted that having someone with Lorena's diplomatic experience would be valuable, because humans sometimes struggled with the subtler aspects of galactic culture, and having a respected liaison from a neutral station would help smooth many potential conflicts. She warned, however, that serving on a human vessel meant adapting to Deathworlder standards, and the gravity would be heavier than Lorena was accustomed to, and the food would be different, and the pace of operations was intense because human crews worked long hours with minimal rest, and the danger level was significant. because they actively sought out dangerous situations in order to help people. Lyrina smiled and gestured to Ember and Frost, who had heard the entire conversation through their bond, and were radiating excitement and approval. And she stated that her dragons were excellent judges of character, and if they trusted the humans, then so did she. And besides, after 70 years of routine diplomatic work, she was ready for something more meaningful than negotiating trade agreements. Brooks laughed and officially invited Lyrina to serve as civilian cultural liaison aboard the Defiant Storm, and explained that they could provide quarters suitable for an elf and 2 dragons, and the ship's gravity could be adjusted in certain sections to make the transition easier, and they even had a hydroponics bay where Frost could enjoy the cooler temperatures. The next hour was a flurry of activity as Lyrina arranged for a leave of absence from her station duties and packed the few personal belongings she wanted to bring, and said goodbye to colleagues who thought she was insane for voluntarily boarding a Deathworlder warship, but understood her desire to be part of something. Important Lord Vestian personally came to see her off, and he admitted that he had misjudged the humans badly, and had learned an important lesson about not letting fear and prejudice cloud his judgment, and he made Lyrina promise to send regular reports about her experiences because the galaxy needed to understand that humans were not the monsters that rumors suggested. She boarded the Defiant Storm with Ember and Frost following close behind, and immediately noticed the difference in gravity, because everything felt slightly heavier and more solid and her muscles had to work harder just to walk normally. But the effect was not unbearable, and she suspected she would adapt quickly. Captain Brooks gave her a brief tour of the ship, and Lyrina was impressed by the efficiency of the design because every space served multiple purposes, and nothing was wasted. And the human crew moved through the corridors with practiced ease, completely comfortable in the higher gravity that made Lyrina feel like she was constantly climbing uphill. The quarters assigned to her were surprisingly spacious, with a separate area for the dragons that included temperature controls and a viewing port. And Brooks explained that the ship's previous cultural liaison had been a Thraxian who required cold environments, so the cooling system was already installed. Lyrina met several crew members during the tour, and each one greeted her warmly and expressed genuine pleasure at having her aboard, and she noticed that the humans seemed completely unbothered by having an elf and 2 dragons joining their crew, and treated her with the same easy camaraderie they showed each other. That evening, the fleet departed from Celestial Harmony Station, and Lyrina stood at the observation port in her quarters, watching the station grow smaller in the distance, and she felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness, because she was leaving behind everything familiar to venture into the unknown with beings that most of the galaxy feared. Ember chirped softly and pressed against her side, offering comfort through their bond, and Frost hummed in agreement and released a small cloud of cool air that felt refreshing in the slightly too warm environment, and both dragons projected confidence and contentment because they understood that their bonded companion had made the right choice. Captain Brooks' voice came through the room's communication system, inviting Lyrina to join the bridge crew for the jump to the next system, and Lyrina accepted eagerly because she wanted to see how human ships operated. And as she made her way through the corridors with her dragons following, she reflected on the extraordinary events of the past day she had witnessed. Deathworlders demonstrate compassion and sacrifice in ways that challenged every prejudice the galaxy held about Earth. And she had seen human beings choose to protect strangers at great cost to themselves. And she had learned that strength and kindness were not opposites but could exist together in the same beings. The bridge was a hub of controlled activity, with crew members working at various stations, monitoring systems and coordinating fleet movements, and Brooks gestured for Lyrina to stand beside the captain's chair where she would have the best view, and explained what each station controlled. The navigation officer announced, "Jump preparation complete," and Brooks gave the order to engage the faster-than-light drive, and Lyrina felt a strange sensation as the ship slipped into jump space and the stars outside the viewport transformed into brilliant streaks of light. She realized that her life had changed completely in just one day, and that she was now part of something larger than herself because she would help bridge the gap between humanity and the wider galaxy, and